Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the ongoing series here on Svarim Cheddar about Spanish Jewry through the ages. So, on this episode of the series, actually newly recorded, we discuss the Spanish Gedolim, Rabbanim, mainly the Talmudists and Halachis in Muslim Spain. So, this is kind of going again from early on, let's just say from like the year 1000, thereabouts, until I think we went till the Rambam. So, but the 13th century, essentially. So that's really what it's going to focus on. I will say the poets and the Paitanim we kind of discussed in the previous episode with Professor Bran. And then the philosophers really haven't covered yet. It's something that I may return to later. Right now, I don't have anything on that. So we haven't done that. Also have not, well, I should say, we have not really discussed like the disputation of the Ramban. We haven't really gotten to there. So I'm just mentioning that here because this is kind of the last episode in Muslim Spain, even though there is a lot more to discuss. So if you want to hear more on it, email me, but maybe it's something we'll return to. But in general, the project, I've been curious what anyone thinks so far of this series. It's kind of pretty ambitious, so to speak. It's differs than the Shabtai Tzvi series. The previous series was defined on something more defined. This is kind of spanning centuries and trying, especially Muslim Spain, and then going to Christian Spain. So this will kind of be the end, so to speak, of Muslim Spain as we transition towards Christian Spain, so to speak. Again, using very general terms here. I know there was no Spain still at this time where we are, but we're somewhere still in the early, from the 11th to the 13th century, let's just say, and to orient you. And then we will be moving on after this next week, getting into the Papal Inquisition, kind of the Inquisition, before moving on to the riots of 1391. And then after that will come the Conversos, Moranos, New Christians, whatever term you want to use, even though they might differ a little, but let's just say one term. And then after that, getting into the Inquisition, followed by the expulsion, etc. So that will be to come. But again, this episode is trying to give a broad sweep of the halachist and the Talmudists, let's just say, because again, it's not, I don't want to say Rabbanim or Gedolim, because we're not talking about the poets and the philosophers, etc. There's a lot there. So perhaps later on, we'll get to that. Also, I don't have anything recorded as of yet on the same type of episode on Christian Spain. Let's just say Christian Spain, but again, later on Spain. 14th, 15th century. So if you like this kind of episode and you want to hear something like this again on later on Spain, let me know. I know it's something that has to be added. And again, like I said, the series is kind of ambitious. I'm sure there will be things that are missing out. So if you want to hear something about a specific area, please email me, nachi@svarimcheddar.com or svarimcheddar@gmail.com, whichever works. Additionally, I would like to thank once again the corporate sponsor of the series, Gluck Plumbing. So for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. I met someone recently who said, he was going to call Gluck Plumbing to run a gas line. He ended up not calling someone in Lakewood. I mean, come on, what's the excuse? Call them. You want to run a gas line, you want to run something, anything plumbing related in Lakewood, again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And I thank them again for their generosity in sponsoring this series, as well as previous Shabtai series and many other episodes on the podcast. Speaking of which, if anyone wants to sponsor an episode of the podcast, again, I've mentioned this a number of times, it is $360. You can email me, again. Also, there'll be a link via PayPal, as well as now the podcast can take Zelle. But the Zelle is svarimchatter@gmail.com. That email will be in the show's notes as well. And if you can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, as I mentioned in the previous episode, 24/6. The podcast is on 24/6, so check it out on there and subscribe in there as well. And wherever you get your podcast. And again, enjoy this fourth episode in the Spain series, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Swarm Chatter podcast and another episode on the ongoing series on the Spanish Jewry through the ages. On this episode of the podcast and series, I'm going to be joined by Professor Marc Herman, who is the Assistant Professor of Pre-Modern Jewish History at York University in Toronto, Canada, and he's a member of the faculty of the Koshitsky Center of Jewish Studies at York. And we'll be discussing kind of a broad, sweeping look at the Rabbanim, Gedolim, Rishayim, however you want to, Talmudists, Halachis. We can use yeshivish and academic lingo here on the figures in Muslim Spain. So again, it's in Spain, but I guess we were just telling Professor Herman we're really in Al-Andalus this episode. We're really very firmly in the Muslim Spain. So this episode is only going to focus on those figures. So I already teased we won't be discussing Rajba and Ramban and Ran and Ritva and all the later figures that many listeners will be assuming are Spanish, Sephardi, Gedolim, Rishayim, they used to their Sfarim. That's not going to be covered in this episode. Anyways, let's get to the episode. So thank you, Professor Herman, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here. Avid listener.
Yeah, okay. So let's start off, tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I grew up just outside Toronto. Went to Brandeis and spent some time in Gush and YU, and then got my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and the Department of Religious Studies. After that, I held a few postdocs before beginning this position at York last summer.
Okay, so we're obviously we're going to be discussing Muslim Spain and a lot of the figures there. So this stuff. And how did you get involved with this? You've done work on Rambam and...
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you mentioned Al-Andalus, right? That's just to catch everyone up, to sort of inform everybody, that's the Arabic term for the region of southern Spain that became known as Sfarad in Jewish culture. And Al-Andalus was part of the reason I got interested in it, because it's sort of one of the major centers of Talmudic learning in the Islamic world. My work really focuses on Jews in the Islamic world, Jews who wrote in Judeo-Arabic in addition to Hebrew. And there's a few major centers that basically we sort of know about Baghdad and the Gaonim. We know sort of about Egypt and some other place in North Africa. And the other obviously looming center is this very long and illustrious community in Al-Andalus in Jewish Sfarad. So it's sort of that is one piece of this much larger picture that I'm interested in.
Okay, so let's start off here. Let's kind of so listeners are familiar already with a couple of, or if not, refer back to the kind of a general broad sweep of the region, of the area. And again, like I said, we're in, we're going to start early on in Muslim Spain in the early 1000 or before, in the early 1,000 years ago. And so let's set the stage of Spain. What's again, we're focusing this episode on Talmudic learning, halacha. So we're not going to be, we'll make mention of maybe the grammarians and poetry. There already was an episode with Professor Ross Brand, listeners of hers. We're not doing that. We're not doing the Parshanim on Chumash and those things. But anyways, on the Talmudic halacha, so let's say yeshiva learning, so to speak, to use the term. Where are the origins? Where does it start? What are the basic figures to begin?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. And it's something that we can't really answer. We obviously know that there were Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, but so much of their Judaism, their Jewish expression, really until the late 10th century, and even into the early 11th, is something of a mystery. Only in the 10th century do we really get named figures. Before that, we have these sort of elusive reports about that claims to long-standing learning or ancient connections, but we don't really know that much about these communities. So we have figures like Shmuel HaNaggid, who we'll meet in a few minutes, who sort of claim that Jewish learning dates back to the times of the Gemara already, etc. We have a bit later stories of a certain Natronai ben Hachinai, who we don't really know anything about, whose name is bandied about as someone who brought the Talmud. We have this letter that's sent in the late around the 10th century from Pumbedita in Baghdad that tells us that Palto Gaon sent Talmud Upitrono, whatever that might mean. No one really knows the Talmud and its explanation. No one really knows what that means, but that would date Jewish learning in the 9th century. And then that same letter tells us that there were so many donkeys couldn't even carry all the chuvot that were connected between Baghdad and Al-Andalus. But these are all really hard to know that much about and really to be able to clarify. Only in the ninth and early 10th century do we get more figures. Perkoy ben Bavoy, who's a polemicist writing from Baghdad, tells us that there's Jewish learning in Spain. He talks about, Bate Midrashot in the 9th century. And we have this other figure named Elazar Bar Shmuel, whose name appears a little bit in Gaonic literature as someone who made an impression on certain Gaonim, but we don't know much about these guys. A little bit later, we actually get some more detail, and that might be also from these Chuvot from the Gaonim. So that is, the Gaonim would correspond with Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean, sending them questions. The Mediterranean communities would send them questions, and the Gaonim would respond with answers, and also obviously asking for a little donation along the way. So we have a bunch of these Chuvot. The most famous of them is actually the Seder of Amram Gaon, which is allegedly sent to Barcelona. Although the history of that work is very, very complicated. But we have those sort of texts as well that would tell us that there is some sort of Jewish learning going on. And some of these questions, the question is, what can you tell about the communities based on these questions? So on the one hand, we have, sometimes we have very simple questions, very basic question. Tell me what I'm supposed to pray. That's a rather rudimentary question. Other times they get more advanced. So you can sort of infer from the questions that are asked a little bit about the community. I mean, it's not really until the late 10th century that we get, major figures or figures who have some sort of lasting impact, even a little bit, on the halachic tradition. And they all sort of circle around this figure named Chasdai ibn Shaprut. Chasdai ibn Shaprut is a very important courtier with the Umayyads, who were the local Muslim dynasty in the late 10th century. And he, as part of this sort of program to advance Sephardic community and learning, brought in a bunch of some figures. The person we're told that he brought in is a figure named Moshe ben Chanoch. And Moshe ben Chanoch and his son Chanoch ben Moshe from Italy become the first really to lead the centers of Jewish learning in Spain. We actually have some Chuvot from them. So this tells us that they were, figures of some stature. They knew how to learn. They knew how to write responsa. They were authorities. These Chuvot, if any listener, this is going to be another running theme, I guess, throughout the episode today. These Chuvot are have not really been systematically studied in almost a century. There's one article from Simcha Asaf written, decades and decades ago, where he talks about them. But they're really waiting. Someone should go through them and really tell us more systematically what we can have about them. But what scholars infer about the selection of this guy, Moshe ben Chanoch, from Italy into Spain, is that Chasdai and his circle was pushing back against Gaonic authority and Babylonian authority. And this is another running theme we'll see throughout, the 11th and 12th centuries. This real tension, even after the Gaonim are basically out of the picture, Spanish, Andalusian, halachic authorities are concerned with Gaonic authority, and Chasdai begins that as well. And there's one other sort of interesting data point here, is that there's a report from an Arabic Muslim author who tells us that in this era, Jews around Chasdai sort of decided they could make their own calendar. They could calculate the calendar on their own, which we don't really know how to verify that, but it sounds like something Chasdai would do. Right? All this sort of fits into this picture of putting Sfarad on the map and becoming independent of the Gaonim. But in terms of the caliber, in terms of the content of their learning, it's very, very difficult to talk about in much detail, really until the turn of the millennium with the next generation of figures.
Okay, so Chasdai ibn Shaprut he's in the 10th century, right?
Mm-hmm. He died around 975. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things to just unpack there before we move on. So Chasdai himself, listeners will have heard he was like a poet, things with Professor Brand's episode. But do we know, was he himself a Talmud Chacham of any repute? Do we know anything about that?
There's no reason to believe that he was. He received the title Rosh Kala, which means head of the academy, head of the row, something like that, from apparently from one of the Gaonic academies. But the Gaonim would give out these titles not based on sort of expertise or learning, but really because they wanted to honor and fundraise from local elites. So there's no reason to believe that he was a Talmudist or a halachist of any stature.
Okay, and like you said, originally, we have with the Seder of Amram going, originally they were everything or whatever we know, they were kind of under Babylonian authority, asking questions, getting answers. So then it begins to change. And when it begins to change is when we kind of start to see whether that's when it began or not. We really begin to see kind of the growth, or I don't know how you want it, where do you want to use, of the Spanish, Talmudists, or again, Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that we can discount the early legends as sort of legendary reports, it really seems that with Moshe ben Chanoch and Chanoch ben Moshe, there becomes like sort of some serious learning. Obviously, Chasdai thought it was important, to bring in people from outside to start a yeshiva, but it wasn't. It certainly, we don't have any reason to believe there was much more going on before the late 10th century.
Okay, so now you said he brought in these from Italy, but what about the first, again, I don't know what the right word is to use, Spanish. And one more thing before that, let's just tell the listeners where we're holding it. We had these kind of overview episodes here. Which part of the Iberian Peninsula are we really talking about here?
Yeah, so most of these figures are living in Cordoba and Lucena. So Lucena is sort of famously the city of the Jews, it's called. Probably means it has a very large proportion of Jewish population. And Cordoba is the other major center, obviously the Rambam much later, but other figures are sort of bouncing around that part of Granada and other related nearby areas.
Okay, so the first figure is Shmuel HaNaggid. Is he the first?
Yeah, so Shmuel HaNaggid is really the first serious halachic writings, other than these Tshuvot from Chanoch ben Moshe and his father, Moshe.
Okay, so again, his poetry aside, the piyutim that we dealt with previously. Again, referring listeners back. I'll keep doing that. I keep referring you back when there's something in the previous episode with Professor Brand. So now with him though, you can just recap though briefly. He was a general, and briefly his position. He was kind of.
I mean, that's the story, right? That he was a poet of some grandeur, and he lost his family fortune when around age 20. Was sort of caught in a bind when he was discovered by one of the local, what are known as in English as party kings of the Kingdom of Granada, where he became a military leader for this community. How much of the details of his early life are very, very difficult to know how much we can trust. He apparently was a student of Judah Chayuj, who's a major figure in Hebrew grammar, and also Chanoch ben Moshe, the son of our first Rosh Yeshiva in Al-Andalus, in Halakha. So that sort of seems to be his connection. And he does quote every once in a while. We have quotations from him, referring back to stuff he learned from Chanoch ben Moshe.
Okay, so what about his writing? What writings do we have from him?
Yeah, so we were talking before. The first thing we should mention is that the major work that people associate with Shmuel HaNaggid is actually not by this Shmuel HaNaggid. If anyone opens a Gemara Brachot, at the end you'll see a Mavola Talmud or Mavola Talmud, whatever it's called there. It says the same name, Shmuel HaNaggid. So that actually is a translation of a summary of the introduction to the Talmud by Shmuel ben Chofni Gaon, written a few decades, or I guess around this time, maybe a little bit older than Shmuel HaNaggid. And this translation made its way, as these things do, into the Babylonian Talmud. So the major work we have from him in Halakha, or have pieces of, or citations of, is called the Hilchot HaGavrata, which is a complicated work that we don't really know what it is. Another running theme is that we don't really know so much of this with certainty. There was a debate in the 20th century between two important scholars about just how all-encompassing this work was. Was it about every single area of halakha, sort of the way we think of the Rambam, or, and this seems more likely, was it just focused on difficult passages in the Bavli? That is like dealt with hard sugyot, but not really all-encompassing commentary the way we sort of see later. And this work was apparently written in both Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. That's sort of Arabic in Hebrew characters. And like many of the works actually in the 11th century, there's several works that were both written in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. We also have a few Tshuvot. Some of them are printed in the Pe'er Ador, published first by Yaakov Sesportas. And there's a few more that are manuscript, but very few have survived. So the major work really is this Hilchot HaGavrata that was compiled by Margoliot in the 20th century. And mostly we don't have original copies of this work. Mostly what we have are later citations in mostly Spanish Rishonim. So the Ramban quotes him a number of times, and other figures quote this work. And so that's how we're able to reconstruct the sort of basics of this work. And the truth is we don't know so much about it, we can't really say a whole lot. other than every once in a while, and controversially, he went out and attacked no less a figure than Hagon. Right, this is the major Gaon, an older figure than Shmuel HaNaggid, but nevertheless he attacked him in writing, and he attacked other Gaonic positions. The most famous one, this one is actually quoted. Everyone. This is something everyone does today, which is that in Rosh Hashanah, everyone will daven in Musaf 9 brachot. Right, everyone says Malchut Zichron Shofrot in Rosh Hashanah silent Shmona Esrei and in the public Shmona Esrei. This actually was not the practice of the Gaonim. The Gaonim said in the private Shmona Esrei people would say 7, and the tradition that we have to say 9 actually dates back to the Naggid, apparently from this work. So in a figure we'll meet in a few minutes quotes Shmuel HaNaggid on his position, who's quoting already back earlier figures on this very, so that's one area of halakha, and everyone practices that. I don't know anybody who's encountered a community that says 7 in Musaf in the private Shmona Esrei, and so that's something that is dated to Shmuel HaNaggid. But in terms of the full scope of this work, in terms of its full content, it's really quite difficult to know so much about it.
Now, just a little bit, one more thing about this work. Is this work like a halachic work or like a Talmudic work? And I'll say, I know we're pre-Rambam, we're pre-Rif, so there's not really that fine distinction of like a halacha sefer or a Talmudic.
Yeah, so from the citations, it seems to be sort of finding the psak halacha and sometimes dealing with Talmudic analysis. Right? There's this impression that the Sfardim or the early Sfardim, for some reason, were very interested in psak, in practical law. And I'm not sure how true that is, as a characterization, but they were also interested in this. We see it in this work, in the citations of this work, that clearly in some analysis of hard sugyot. So that's something that so it's both.
Okay.
And go
ahead.
Yeah, the other last piece of Shmuel HaNaggid is here. That's this. You really see the role of this push against the Gaonim. And this, aggrandization of Sfarad coming hand in hand, right? Shmuel HaNaggid is the, more than Chasdei Ibn Shapur, more than anyone after him, is the most sort of biggest propagandist for Sfarad, and it comes out and manifests itself in his halachic writings as again pushing against the Gaonim, and so upholding his own, teachers, Moshe ben Chanoch and his son Chanoch ben Moshe.
Yeah. Now, you said he had a yeshiva, and what either Talmidim did he have, or what kind of figures were in the yeshiva or around his time?
Right, it's difficult to know. So we don't know exactly who was his student. There are a few figures that are sort of interesting in this period, in the early part of the 10th century, that we don't know so much about. So the one of I jotted down a couple figures here. Just the first one that is maybe a little more well known, is an important parshan in Yehuda and Bal'am. Right, he died in around the 1070s, so he's probably a little bit younger, or give or take, than Shmuel HaNaggid. We don't actually know to the extent that he was a Talmudist, nor if he had any relationship with Shmuel HaNaggid. But he also sort of reflects ideas that are anti-Gaonic, which would speak to this circle. But there's one other very, very interesting and important figure in this period, and that's David ben Sadia Hager. So this is a figure that maybe 30, 40 years ago we knew very, very little about. His name appears in the Shita Mekubetzet, maybe in a couple other places. We have a tshuva from Avraham and Rambam, but we don't really know so much about it until in the past few decades, two scholars in Israel, David Skler and Tzvi Stamfer, found and published a number of pieces from this very, very important halachic compendium. And this figure, David ben Sadia Hager, maybe Ibn Muhajir, there's some debate about how to pronounce his father's patronym. Apparently lived in Granada, and he lived in the circle of the Naggid. We don't really know so much about him. David Skler thinks that he found a poem of the Naggid that might be talking about this figure, which is entirely possible. It could be that his father converted. We really, really don't know much about his personal life. Other than he wrote a few important works. One is the Mishpatei Shavuot. If anyone's ever learned Masachet Shavuot, in the back there's ascribed to the, I think it's in that work ascribed to the Rif or maybe someone else, depending on the printings, this work on the laws of Shavuot, which actually was written by this figure. And this more important Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew work called the Kitab al-Chawi, which is to translate that means like a Sefer Kolel, or the sort of all-encompassing halachic compendium. This is a fascinating work. It's apparently a handbook for judges that addressed a lot of different halachic topics. There's a lot of divorce, there's laws of the festivals, but most interesting perhaps, and this is really quite unique between the Gaonim and the Rambam, he's the only person that really does this at great length, is he writes about legal theory. And he's very interested in sort of the sources of the law. He writes a lengthy commentary on the 13 Midot of Rabbi Shmuel, right? He criticizes halacha gedolot at some length. So this seems to have been a very important halachic work. We don't have a lot of it, or the whole thing. And as far as you know, a publication of this work is forthcoming.
Okay, very fascinating. That's very, very interesting. So the next kind of figure, I guess, to discuss is one that we have to talk about his name. I don't want to get bogged down. I remember when I had the episode with Yaakov Taubes, we were busy with Bachya, Bechaya. I don't want to be busy with that type of thing. But in the yeshiva world, he's known as the Ritz Geyis, but his name was Ghayyat. His name wasn't Geyis.
Yeah,
sure.
Ghayyat, maybe. Right.
Right. Something I can. So talk about his name, the proper pronunciation, but just for everyone, we're talking Ritz Geyis, so they should know who we're talking about, because in the yeshiva world, they do know of him.
Yeah, so certainly he's a figure that people know about. He's a very important Talmudist also we're getting into the 11th century. He headed a yeshiva in Lucena. He died around the year 1089. And if you look at this sort of standard reference works, they'll give you usually the name Ghayyat, G-H, at the beginning, or Ghayyat, something like that. And in the yeshiva world, for whatever reason, I guess it's easier to pronounce. As far as I know, he's called the Ritz Geyis, which is a little bit easier pronunciation.
Exactly. Okay, so let's talk about him a little bit.
Yeah, so he is also one of these, like, another very, very interesting and incredibly diverse Sephardi Rishon, right? With all these figures, many of the figures we met so far, they didn't specialize in one sort of area. They dabbled in theology, in philosophy, in poetry, and in halakha, sometimes in parshanut, right? So he obviously, I'm sure Professor Brand spoke about his very important poetry. He's lauded as sort of one of the famous 5 Isaacs by Ibn Daud, writing about a century later. He apparently was a Neoplatonist of some caliber, and who may have had, there's some debate about this. Some of the figures claim that he had a relationship with the HaNaggid. Other people assert that it seems like he didn't have such a close relationship with him. He doesn't cite him all that often. Either way, that seems to be his sort of basic background. He's in this world, heading a yeshiva in Lucena, and a very important yeshiva that the Rif would eventually take over. There's sort of a few major, outside of his poetry, a few major works. He wrote a very, very lengthy commentary on Kohelet. If you actually open Tafech's Chamesh Megillot, which is available on Hebrew Books, so he published this commentary, ascribed it to Sadia, but that apparently is a very old mistake. It was certainly not written by Sadia. It was written by our figure Ibn Ghayyat, whoever will pronounce that. There are later reports of him writing a lot. Moshe Ibn Ezra, an important poetry, Avraham ben Rambam, the Miri all talk about him writing a ton. We don't actually have that much from him. It's not clear even how much they saw. If you look in Hebrew books, you'll find some other material ascribed to him. We also even have this was a very popular genre, a halachic poem. In this case, he wrote on Hilchot Tefillin, right? He wrote on the laws of Tefillin. He wrote the basic background, in poetic form, which is a very popular genre in the medieval world. So,
I want to ask about Shari Simcha.
There's two major halachic works that he wrote. One is the Shari Simcha, which is as far as I know, is a book that was given much later, title that was given later. According to the Geniza book list, this work is called Halachot Klulot, right, which apparently means sort of all-encompassing. We only have the parts on the Chagim, and a separately printed discussion of Hilchot Pesach. But it's sort of an interesting hodgepodge work, something of an encyclopedic compendium, let's say. Ibn Ziyad quotes a ton of of Gaonic writings. This is a major source of Gaonic halachic positions, and in that, just by doing that, he seems already to be moving away a little bit from Naggid. That is, he was much more respectful and interested in Gaonic positions, apparently, than the Naggid was, and Ibn Ziyad and figures around him apparently even produced some of the very important collections of Gaonic Tshuvot that were printed, that we have. So it seems like a lot of those have their roots originally in Spanish collections of Gaonic responsa. And so sometimes in this work, in what's printed as Shari Simcha, the author will compare the Naggid with the Gaonic positions. He'll sort of give a whole summary of halachic literature. Also very interested in halachic conclusions, in Psak Halacha. He also wrote this book that's known in Hebrew as the Sefer HaNer, which apparently was a commentary on the Talmud. There's some debate exactly how all-encompassing it was. Yisrael Meir Tashma thought it really covered the whole Talmud. Other people are less convinced. This apparently also was written both in Hebrew and Arabic, and was cited in a number of different number of later Rishonim. There was a relatively recent publication from a colleague named Dan Greenberger in Ginzei Kedem, who published some pieces of this work. Again, we don't really know so much about it. Was this a full-on, commentary the way we think of later, the Ritva and the Ran, or was this also, and this seems more likely, although it's hard to really know, just sort of on difficult Talmudic passages again? So we have this another sort of this Sefer HaNer seems to have been was on sort of hard topics, complicated sugyot, let's say. That's sort of the Ritz Geyis in a nutshell of his major halachic contributions.
So I want to mention, so Shari Simcha, so I think, was it originally published by Wurzburger Rav, Rabbi Yitzchak Bamberger?
Yeah. You could find all this. It's very easily accessible on Hebrew books. You find all the information there. Yeah,
his is on Hebrew books in 1860. He published it. He calls it Shari Simcha of Nikra Gam Me'asharim, and he says he published commentary Yitzchak Yiranin. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Levi Bamberger. I did a podcast on the Wurzburger Rav, and there's actually I think there's a new edition. It's like, I don't know, 30, 40 years old, from Machon Chassam Sofer. I think that's who did it. It's like two volumes. So, but this is like you said, a relatively famous work. Now, we're going to talk about the Rif shortly, basically Alfasi. How could we not one of these? But before that, I would just want to ask you about his relationship. Was there a relationship between the Ritz Geyis and him? And or you could leave that first and talk about first any other pre-Rif figures.
Yeah. So there's one. Maybe this goes against the Mishnah, but we'll talk about the second question first. The one other figure sort of in this circle was Yitzchak ben Baruch Al-Balia, who apparently was related to Ibn Daud through his father's side, the author of the Sefer Kabbalah. So we know a lot about him. He wrote this work called Kupat HaRochlim, according to Ibn Daud. Doesn't survive at all. Apparently was also on hard Talmudic passages. What does survive from him past citations of, is this work on the Jewish calendar. Or if you look in Avram Barchia and Yitzchak Yisraeli, Yisod Olam, and the Sefer Ibur of Barchia, you see citations from this work on this rather intricate topic of how to determine the Jewish calendar. So this is a interesting work that survived and was quoted later. What's in and like Ibn Ghayyat, and Al-Balia apparently was a prominent figure. And when the Rif showed up in Spain in 1088, the Rif got in a number of battles with some local authorities, one of whom was Ibn Ghayyat. Another one was Al-Balia. Dan Greenberger published, this was known for a long time, but Dan Greenberger actually published some of this debate that the Rif had with Yitzchak Al-Balia. And the other person the Rif criticized was an earlier Spanish Rishon, David ben Sadia Hager, who we mentioned earlier, and that was he criticized him quite harshly in the Tshuvot, in the Tshuvot, and it seems to be something of the Rif sort of coming into his own and sort of taking on local authorities. So that was the beginning of a major shift, I think, in the halachic traditions that we can really trace from the Naggid through these figures into the middle of the 11th century. And by the late 11th century, in 1088, when the Rif shows up, right, he's pushing back very hard against local traditions, and in doing battle with some of these figures.
Okay, so first of all, you mentioned Ibn Dawood a bunch of times. From Ibn Dawood was the Sefer Kabbalah, which is not a Kabbalistic work; it's a historical work, and he also wrote Emun Harama, which is a philosophical work. So Emun Harama, there's 2 new editions of the past couple of years. In Sefer Kabbalah, there's an English edition. Just mentioning him, we're not discussing kind of philosopher historians, but yeah, okay. Let's go to the Rif. Who we were talking beforehand, and you said I did an episode a while back with Dr. Ezra Shvat on the Rif. Who, by the way, I will say that Machon Hamar finally printed their Shas, and inside of the Shas is the critical edition of the Rif, of Shvat's Rif. It's also accessible on alotera.org for anyone who wants to see a critical edition of the Rif. Anyways, so more in depth on the Rif, refer back to that episode. But to talk a little bit about the Rif here, and especially in the context of pre-Rif figures, Rif, post-Rif figures in Spain, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, so the Rif I mentioned, he shows up in 1088. He's already an old man by this time. He's already about 75. Bringing with him these North African traditions. He probably wasn't a student of Rabbeinu Hananel, but he certainly was in that world, and was very conversant with North African halachic traditions, which were different somewhat, than the Spanish ones, than the ones in Sfarad. And this caused him to do to come to battle with some local figures. I think it's quite significant that he criticized, for example, David ben Sadia for not relying on the Gaonim, which might be sort of tell us something about how the Rif thought these earlier figures sort of stack up versus the Gaonim. He moves initially to Cordoba and then to Lucena, and even though he did battle with some of the locals, Shalom Yahalom has actually shown that in certain places the Rif changed his mind and incorporated Sephardic halachic rulings in his halachot. So he is very interested in Spanish thought, and he becomes this major figure in Spain. And his own attitude towards the Gaonim is complex, and something that's still waiting to be studied. It's been studied a good amount, but there's probably much more to be done. But he becomes the Rosh Yeshiva in Lucena, and becomes a major figure, right? Obviously, he's celebrated by later generations, and certainly in Sfarad, this begins very quickly. Moshe Ibn Ezra, a poet, our friend Avraham Ibn Daoud, are very celebratory of him. Obviously, the Rambam. And the story goes that he had this very important Talmud, Ibn Migash, who was his student and who he studied with him for 13 years. Who he actually passes over his own son Yaakov to place Ibn Migash in as the Rosh Yeshiva in Lucena.
And we're going to get to Ibn Migash. The Rif, as you said, he was from Morocco. I said he was North African. He comes at the end of his life. Whatever the story is, he's chased out of there and he ends up in Spain. So when does he write his magnum opus, his halacha, his Hilchas Alfasi, Hilchas Rif, and does he incorporate Spanish versus his North African teachings in there?
Yeah, so it seems like he's 75 years old, so I would think he would have accomplished most of his work by then. I would hope. But he does include certain. It clearly comes with it, I guess, as a more or less finished work. But apparently, he wasn't somebody who thought things as finished, and he was constantly updating and tinkering with it. And he does include important Spanish rulings, halachic positions, practices in this work as well.
Okay, and you already mentioned his yeshiva. I don't know if you have anything else to say about his yeshiva or his works, or we should move on to the Ri Migash.
Yeah, the Ri Migash is another obviously very, very important figure.
Go ahead.
Sure. So the Ri Migash, some people think it's pronounced Migas. That's a question that might not be able to be answered. Apparently, he was born around 1077, died in 1141. And we know from Ibn Daoud that he studied he learned a long time with the Rif. And there's some indications that he had some interest in non-Talmudic topics, but really his major contribution was in halakha. He took over for the Rif. He replaced his own son, and he was a major figure who was incredibly influential. And it's very, very difficult to talk about the Ri Migash and to think about him without these sort of massive compliments. Ibn Daoud said he had a lev rachav, and the Rambam in the introduction to the Parsha Mishnah, talks about this figure. The Rambam was not somebody to give out compliments, willy nilly, let's say. And he heaps praise on the Ri Migash endlessly. And the Rambam's father, Maimun, was a student of the Migash, and the Rambam had a lot of traditions from the Migash, and he very much respects him. And he tells us, and that tells us something. I think what the Rambam saw in him tells us something a lot about him, about who the Migash was. Right, and when the Rambam, is constantly, whenever the Rambam refers to, Sephardi Gaonim or Andalusian Gaonim or something like that, he's almost always or very often referring to the Migash. And every time, let's say, we have a writing through Migash, the Rambam is constantly dealing with it. So the Migash was an important thinker, who we have actually very, very little from. And we don't know how much he wrote on. Tashma thinks maybe on 7 Maseftot, some of which apparently written in Arabic, but very, very early on, his commentaries on Bava Batra and Shvuot are the only ones that are cited. Those are the ones that were not written in Arabic. Tashma suggests that the reason they were lost is because they were in Arabic, although it's quite difficult to know. We in the Shitim Gubetzet in Bava Batra, he quotes Betzalel Ashkenazi quotes the Migash all the time. He also wrote apparently this book called Megillat Starim, which is a popular title in the medieval world, that no one really knows what its contents were. Some say it was on the Rif, maybe it was on Shatz, hard Sugyot, and no one knows, because we don't really have much from it. And then we have these Chuvot that were apparently largely written in Arabic and later translated into Hebrew. And those are sort of his major books and contributions to the Jewish library. The Migash is a totally independent thinker, and is known for a lot of different features. I'll just try and talk about a few of them that are perhaps of interest. The first is that he's obviously very respectful of the Gaonim, respectful of Rabbi Hananel and his teacher, the Rif, but he's in no way subservient to them. It's a little bit of a debate among the scholars, but I think it's fairly clear that Migash saw himself as an authority and was willing to go against received tradition in halacha when he saw fit. Right? If he thought that a halachic psak was wrong, or a conclusion of it, the way to read a sugya was wrong, he said so, and he disagreed even with the Rif and obviously other figures as well. Apparently, he was the first in Sfarad to know of Rashi. Amir Ashur published a manuscript reference from the Migash that mentions Rashi. Apparently, this by this time it had trickled down to Sfarad. And the other major feature, I think, of his writings, and this is something also that requires more study, so I'll sort of just touch on it here, is that Migash seems to have been a big conceptualist, or like a lamdin, right? He was a conceptual thinker, and that becomes, anyone who's ever learned of a Batra or Shvuot, you get the sense that the Migash is really almost prefiguring Brisk in certain ways in his conceptual ways of thinking. And when even the Ud said he had a lev rachav, which means wide heart, wide brain, or incredible mind, I think that might be what they have in mind, that he has a real conceptual way of approaching sugyot in a way that seems to be a real breakthrough, certainly in Sfarad, if not altogether. The other major sort of interesting thing in the Migash is this question about how he related to the Gaonim. There's a sort of debate in the scholars, but how much he diverged from the Gaonim when he thought he wouldn't. There's a famous tshuva from the Migash, number 114, where he says, everyone should rely on the Gaonim. They're a Beit Din Gadol Mumcha Rabim, and they're experts in halachic authority. But when it comes to his own practice, it really seems like he feels free to reject the Gaonim when he thought that when he saw fit. And it seems more likely that this sort of debate about how much to rely on the Gaonim is sort of something that dates back to the time of the Naggid and sort of continued on through the Migash, and really is a sort of running thread throughout these centuries in Sephardic history. And the Migash himself sort of is on the side of the Gaonim, but when it comes, when the rubber hit the road, when he needed to, patkin, if he wanted to do so against the Gaonim, he did so. He would do so.
So a couple things about him. First of all, you mentioned his Chuvas, which we have. Mechon Yerushalayim did a brand new beautiful edition. I should mention the Rif also. I think we forgot to mention they also new edition of the Rif's Chuvas as well. So any validity to the story? There's some sort of legend with the Rambam, meaning the Migash gets a kiss. What was this story?
It's a story that circulates. It doesn't make sense chronologically. The Migash died apparently in 1141. The Rambam must have been 3 years old. According to most people, he was born in 1138. So certainly, he's probably an Eloi of some point, of some stature. Obviously, the Rambam was. I'm not sure how much that manifested at age 3. But so they didn't really know each other. All the Migash material comes apparently from the Rambam's father, who must have been a close Talmud of the Migash.
Right, which is why I guess the Rambam is referred to sometimes as like a Talmud of the Migash, because that's how we refer to him as. So generally, if we see an opinion of the Migash, the Rambam kind of, not generally, but the Rambam goes with the Migash.
Yeah, I haven't done a systematic study. My experience is that every time the Migash says something to the Rambam that the Rambam was aware of, he certainly takes it seriously. Often will poskim like that against other Rishonim. Right, the Rambam in terms of a Talmud, there was no Talmud Rebbe relationship apparently, but in terms of the halachic traditions and perhaps more, the Rambam is certainly in that world.
Okay, now at the time period that we're holding right now, we're kind of skipping around. We're in the 11th to the 12th century. So we are omitting, we're kind of not discussing Yehuda Levi, the Kuzari, right? The Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Ibn Bakuda, right? Is the Cheves Havavis. So we have other figures here that we're not kind of doing.
Yeah, so each of those figures, in various ways were, Talmudists of some, in different ways. Yehuda Levi does have halachic positions. The date line is a major, famous thing that he talks about. There are other issues that come up. Bachya, much less so. And Ibn Ezra, while he was, clearly an expert, doesn't seem to have been, certainly didn't focus on that, and sometimes misquotes Chazal, and so that sort of led people to think that maybe he wasn't quite as an expert as compared to other of his colleagues. So those figures. Yehuda Levi, for example, was apparently had a close relationship with the Migash, but he didn't excel, obviously, in halachic material.
Right, correct. Okay, so what other figures / works do we have from this time period?
Yeah, so there's one other work that apparently comes out from this circle. This anonymous work called the Isser V'Heter that survives. Apparently, there's 2 different manuscripts of pieces of it. We don't really know much. We're only now learning about it, although it has been accessible. I think it's a manuscript in Oxford. Professor Tzvi Langerman has been publishing chapters of this work. As far as we know, the largest manuscript contains chapters 17 to 51. So it's apparently smack in the middle of this work. Based on the citations, Professor Langerman suggests that it's probably somewhere, because the author cites the Rif and cites the Migash, but not the Rambam. So, if the Rambam existed, you would cite the Rambam. So it must be that this figure apparently was living in the generation of the students of the Migash before the Rambam, was active. There's some pieces that are halachic in this book. There's some halachic summaries of Hilchot Rosh Chodesh, other areas of Jewish law. There's other times that he sort of writes commentaries on the Mishnah. He cites the Gaonim. It's sort of one of these hodgepodge works that typifies a lot of the Sephardic writing, maybe dates further, that reminds us more about what the HaNaggid and Ritz Geyis wrote, even Ghayyat. So this is a work that still requires a lot of careful study. Langerman apparently is working hard on publishing more of it, but I'm sure would calls for much more attention and analysis.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, is that kind of you almost feel like when we get to Christian Spain, which we're not going to discuss, you almost feel like there's more, maybe it's later, we have more preserved, there's more that we're used to dealing with, right? With the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ran, the Nemuch Yosef, the Ritva, the Yad Ramah, Rabbeinu Yoin. I mean, it could go on and on and on of, I'm sure I'm missing many more of Talmudists or Halachists, as opposed to Muslim Spain. However, with Muslim Spain, you kind of have these titans, really, that we're still dealing with today, which is the Rif, the Migash, the Ritz Geyis, and the Rambam. I mean, you have these like major figures. Although the interesting thing is, and we have to talk about the Rambam a little bit here, is like the 2 most major ones, so to speak, is like the Rif is mainly in North Africa, and he ends up coming to Spain at the end, and the Rambam is from Spain, and then he leaves, and he ends up in Egypt later where he writes his work. So it's like interesting how the 2 major ones are like part of Muslim Spain, but they're like not.
Right.
It's just an interesting thing.
Yeah, if anybody, I mean, the Rambam certainly saw himself as, Hasfardi, much more than probably the Rif ever did. The Rambam is very, very proud of, being the descendants of, generations of Talmidei Chachamim and Dayanim in Spain. So yeah, he's very, very proud of this, and it's totally in dialogue with earlier figures.
Yeah, and we'll get back to a little bit discussing the distinction between Muslim and Christian Spain, because as I mentioned, those different Gedalim and the Ramban and Rashba, the beginning ones, and then as I mentioned, Ramban and Geyis, etc. I think today in the yeshiva world or wherever it is, people have this kind of conception of like they're all Sephardi, they're all Spanish, but that's like really wrong, because they're different cultural milieux, different worlds totally. One is Muslim Spain, they're into philosophy, poetry, etc. under the Muslims, and the other one is in Christian Spain. They're not into any of poetry. There's no poetry, there's no philosophy, there's none of this. We have Kabbalah coming out. It's a totally different world. And so they're Mahalach and Lima. We can talk about that. I don't know if we want to talk about it now, or we should get to the Rambam first. But anyways.
Yeah, well, let's cover the Rambam first. There is some poetry in later Spain, but certainly not as central as it was. But you're dealing with two different cultures. Arabic is a major change here, exposure to Islamic thinking versus Christian thinking. It's a very different world they're living in, politically, culturally, etc., etc., etc. But the Rambam obviously deserves a whole 25-part series on its own. But just a few things, sort of just speaking, that sort of connect the Rambam with the world that we talked about so far. As I mentioned, the Rambam is always in dialogue with the earlier Sephardi Rishonim. My experience has been, and I haven't again done a systematic study, but every single time an earlier Sephardi Rishon says something, it sheds light on the Rambam. Right? The Rambam is he doesn't tell us obviously about his sources, but he's always very, very much in dialogue with earlier figures. And this is not just halachic writers. You see this in the Parshanim. Like even Bal'am and even the grammarians, the Rambam, even Janach, we didn't talk about it all. The Rambam is totally in dialogue with these figures, and he is totally aware of Sephardic halakha, Sephardic parshanut, and he's probably, and this is another trend that goes back generations. He's probably more loyal to the Sephardic Rishonim than he is to the Gaonim. Right? The Rambam was not so impressed by the title Gaon, the institution of the Gaonim. He obviously was, when it came to High Gaon, Sadi Gaon, Shurigon, etc. He had more respect for them, but in terms of the institution, he didn't think so highly of it, and he even used, and this is sort of subversive, uses the word Gaonim to refer not just to people and authorities from Baghdad, right? By applying this title much more broadly, the Rambam is telling us that there's nothing special about Jewish Baghdad, and this again clearly comes from a tradition that dates back already to Chasdei Ibn Shaprut. Like, how do the Sephardic Rishonim relate to the Gaonim? And the Rambam is coming out of this tradition very, very clearly. One other little tidbit: Shlomo Dov Goitein pointed out that the Rambam taught his son Avram ben Rambam to write in Sephardic script. So the manuscripts from Avram ben Rambam are in the Sephardic handwriting, apparently, of this time, not in the whatever local Egyptian handwriting that perhaps the Avram and Rambam would have been taught in school.
Yeah, because it's interesting. People think of the Egyptians as Sephardim, but they're not. They're really not, right? The Sephardi post-expulsion, post-1492, later in this series, kind of the Sephardim spread out all over, and they become the dominant culture, and everything becomes Sephardi. But before that, they're not really Sephardim. They're Egyptian Jews. Yeah,
I mean, each of these local medieval subcommunities has their own identity. Sort of the division to Ashkenaz and Sfarad, I think, probably only dates to the Mechaber and the Ramah, right? Once we have sort of the Mechaber versus the Ramah, then you see already the beginnings of only two cultures. But each of these in the medieval world, Provence was its own culture, Germany, France, North Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Each of them had their own distinct local culture and dynamics and traditions that that today maybe people associate with Italy as sort of a unique place, but other places we sort of treat as a hodgepodge. But really, each of these places have their own identity, and division of Ashkenaz and Sfarad is very something later and too simplistic way to think about the medieval Jewish world.
So, as you say, the Rambam really deserves his own series, and hopefully I'll get to that, Mirz Hashem. And if listeners want that, email me, let me know. I think that's something that would require work, but I think that Rambam really is deserving of such, and he's such a fascinating figure. I don't want to shortchange the Rambam here, but it's hard to do the Rambam like a regalachas, just to like, oh, the Rambam, not that it's easy to do any of the other figures you mentioned, but the Rambam's like especially, at least it feels especially daunting to just in a couple of minutes. But at least in our context as a Sephardi and is part of this kind of Spanish world and this chain of Masorah, I mean, what else is there to say about the Rambam?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, he's clearly loyal to the Rif and the Migash. It seems like he was more loyal to them than perhaps the earlier Spanish Rishonim when it came to like halachic conclusions. And as I said, the Rambam saw himself as representative of this tradition. He always talks about Al-Andalus and Sfarad and the minhagim and the halachic conclusions of this community were very important to him. And it even comes down to places in the Parashat Mishnah where he uses Spanish Arabic versus Egyptian Arabic, right? He's very aware of these things, and he's very, very loyal to that community. And he was an outsider when he got to Egypt, and forgotten for a reason. But there were people who were opposed to Rambam, as a foreign interloper in the Egyptian Jewish community, and partly because he was so clearly a Sephardic Jew, and he probably spoke with an accent and a different dialect of Arabic somewhat than the local Egyptian community.
So, a couple other, more general things. First of all, just before that, we're kind of up to the Rambam. We're up to kind of, I don't know where we're holding, here in the 13th century Reconquista begin. I mean, it's always going on in the background. I mean, what are there any other later figures that you would add in, like from Muslim Spain, Talmudic halachic figures?
Not really. We had, the Jewish communities were apparently persecuted quite harshly by the Almohad dynasty that came in and conquered Spain from the Almoravid dynasty, who really held Jewish Spain, and apparently gave Jews the option to convert or to die. People chose different options. The Rambam obviously and his family fled to North Africa and eventually landing in Spain. So this really put an end to the Arabic culture of Sephardic halacha and other rabbinic figures.
Right, and this is why we're that really kind of leads to, but that then we know of the rise of Rabbanim, the Talmudists, the halachis, the Gedolim of Christian Spain in the north. So
right,
well, yeah. Now, what I want to ask you though is that I teased this before. I want to know just a little bit more. Are there any differences that we see, stark differences in Mahalach and Limud, so to speak, because they are so different? Again, people view them as like the same. If you go to yeshiva, it's like the Riv, the Ritz, Geyis, the Migash, and then the Rambam, and the Rashba, the Ramban, and the Ran, and the Geyis, and the Ritz. They're all the same thing in the blender, but they're not really.
Right. So speaking about these figures, I think that there's a widespread assumption or often repeated distinction between this sort of earlier stage of Sephardic Jewry and, let's say, the Balei Tosfot or the later Spanish authorities who were influenced by the Balei Tosfot. And that claim is that the early Spaniards were interested in psak and halacha l'maisa, like how to the bottom line halacha from the Gemara. And the other Tosafot, the Balei Tosfot, certainly later Rishonei Sfarad were more interested in maybe in analyzing the Talmud for its own sake. I'm not convinced that is entirely true, but certainly obviously is not representative of a figure like the Migash. And we really don't, because he was a conceptualist, someone who thought very deeply, in addition to being interested in halacha l'maisa, and in terms of and psak. So the comparison, the question is, can you really talk about a derech halimud, let's say, a mahalach halimud of all of these 200 years of figures? Right? I'm not sure that you can. The Ramban raised the Beit Midrash, and over several generations, people were working in that tradition. The same thing didn't quite happen in Sfarad, in the earlier period, in the 11th and 12th centuries of Sfarad. Obviously, the Rif had a tradition, and the Rif had ways of thinking and halachic positions that were passed on, but that and the HaNaggid sort of tried to do something, but this really were fits and starts, and we can't really speak of as far as I can tell, of a really unified tradition or a unified way of thinking, as much as we have different figures doing sort of different things, and there are themes that run through them, but I'm not sure the theme is mahalach halimud as much as it is other broader issues of how to relate to the Gonim and how to relate to Sfarad, and sort of those kind of issues that I've tried to touch on today.
Right, and then you mentioned Rashi coming into Migash, but then Rashi and then really the Bali Taisus kind of influence, their influences all over the Ramban, Rajba down, in the Christian Spain Rishonim, whereas it's not the case in the ones that we've been discussing in Muslim Spain.
Right. So the Migash apparently has one offhand reference to Rashi, but obviously there's no one has ever said that the Migash was influenced a great deal by Rashi. The Rambam is a more complicated case. It does seem like there were certain times he was accessed and was adopted Rashi positions, but it's difficult to prove. Shama Friedman has a very interesting article on this topic, which seems compelling, but making a broader case is a big challenge. And when you get to figures like the Ramban, obviously, the Baalei Tosafot are the major influence there. The Ramban has a very nice thing to say about the Baalei Tosafot. He studied with many of these figures, and he praises them, quite over the top, I would say. It's very interested in it, and obviously their way of thinking that has its roots in Rabbeinu Tam and the Ri, come and make their way south and really take over what we call Sephardic learning.
Right. Okay. Listen, I think we've tried to really give a feel of the Rabbanim and the Rishonim, Talmudis, Halachis. As we said, we left out the grammarians and the poets I already covered, and we left out the Parshanim. But I think this was something that was lacking in the series, so I wanted to make sure that we got to it. And about we referenced the later ones. I hope to do an episode on the again the Rishonim of Christian Spain, and if listeners are interested in hearing something like that, and me, finding a guest, hopefully, to talk about that, send me an email. But that's something that I hope to do. So, just to close over here, is there any reading on the subject specifically on this that you would reference on this? And not in broad, historical sense, but like what we've been discussing on.
Yeah, so there really isn't. The closest thing to an overview is from Tashma's Sifrut Parshanit LeTalmud, which is a 2-volume work that sort of goes figure by figure, but really focused on people who were interested in writing on the Talmud. So he doesn't really deal with all these figures that we talked about today. I would say that that's a place to start. Tashma has a number of other articles, a number of other people have published on the topic, important pieces. But a systematic study is something that I think that still awaits scholarship and really people interested in this field. And I tried to mention a number of basically everyone I wrote on. There's a lot to write about. I would encourage anyone to to take up any of these topics. And nothing has been exhausted. So there isn't really a good systematic overview. So it would be great if someone would work on it, or people would work on each of the small pieces together.
Absolutely, this is just we were really doing general and scratching the surface here. And so like I said, I already have an episode on the Rif, and the Rambam, like you said, it should be its own series, and hopefully it will be its own series on Sfarim Chatter. And then later on, figures. The Ramban, there is an episode forthcoming. The Sefer Chinuch, there's an episode forthcoming, and other figures that I've done already. So it's kind of, but like a broad sweep, something that's still missing. So
yeah, absolutely. No, there's a lot to be done, and a lot of these figures are very interesting, and there's most of them are pretty accessible. And even like the Migash, it would be a great systematic study of the Migash would be really, really interesting and valuable.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Herman, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.